Hey friends, welcome back to the Renaissance English History Podcast. I have a bit of a treat for you today. One of the perks of being a member or a patron of this podcast is regular author chats. This is a chat we had with my dear friend Adrienne Dillard, who is a historical fiction author, longtime Tudorcon speaker, all around just brilliant human being. We talked about all things related to Anne Boleyn. This was in May, the month where Anne was executed. So Adrienne is the author of, among other books, The Raven's Widow and Corodo. She's currently deep diving into George Boleyn's writings on the Knowles sisters, so this is definitely going to be good. So this conversation went everywhere, from Anne's charisma and courage to the mob of angry Tudor women who chased her down the Strand, to whether Anne really changed history or just surfed the waves already forming around her. Also, fair warning, this conversation contains confessions of fever dreams, mild soapbox moments, and some very honest takes on feminism, Henry VIII, and the Anne Boleyn fangirl industrial complex. So grab your tea or your wine and settle in for a juicy, slightly rebellious chat with the one and only Adrienne Dillard. You got it. Adrienne Dillard, you have written books. You have spoken at Tudorcon. I always say this story about you, but I'm going to say it again. Just like I always remember you because your book on Jane Boleyn, I read it when I was really sick and I was on the couch reading it. And then I had this horrible fever and I kept waking up through the night thinking that I was Jane Boleyn and George, and that I was being killed and that I was with Catherine Howard and and I was just in this fever dream all night and I didn't know I was awake and not awake and I didn't. And so I always associate you with that having been really, really sick time that I had, but in a good way, because it was kind of trippy at the same time. It was kind of enjoyable, but weird.
I love that I inspire nightmares. I should. I think that's a great life goal for a woman to have, is to inspire nightmares.
I agree. Total professional goals is inspiring nightmares. Yeah. So talk to me a little bit. So this has been this year-long shindig of a study group, whatever that people are on, and we've been looking at the top moments in Tudor history. In the past month, we've been on the Great Matter because we've been looking at the Great Matter itself and the rise of Anne, and then the Act of Supremacy, and now this last week was the dissolution. So we've been we've been digging in deep in this stuff. But I would like to speak to you specifically about Anne and how she basically upended England and English history, and how England is different because of her and her family and where she came from. There's a lot of myths about Anne and her family.
Yes.
And so to break some of that down. So my first question to you is, what made Anne so special?
I think some people just have that thing, right? And it nowadays we tend to see them as being celebrities, and a lot of it comes from charisma. I think that one of the things that we can say about Anne is she had a lot of charisma, whether you were on her good side or on her bad side, or even if you didn't like her. I think Chapuis is a perfect example that he did not like Anne. He didn't support her in any way, but he still was really impressed by her composure, impressed by the way that she carried herself. And, one of the quotes I love the most is where he calls her braver than a lion. And I think that that one quote in itself just sums Anne up perfectly, because whether you agree or disagree with the choices and her story, the choices that she made, whatever she was doing took great courage, for good or for bad. And yeah, so I think that she just was a really powerful woman, and she was very influential, and she had the ear of the king. I don't think that I don't buy into this idea that she played hard to get, but I also don't totally attached to the idea that she was just this helpless victim in it either. Because Anne shows us time and time again that she does have agency and she does have power. And my own personal belief is that I think that when Anne is turning Henry down in the beginning, I think she's being sincere because look at what had happened to her sister. I think, she's saying to the king, like, I deserve a true marriage. I deserve, you know, and I think it wasn't until it became clear to her that like Henry was going to do whatever it took to end his marriage to Catherine and marry her, that then she was like, okay, then we're going to buy into this and my family's going to buy into this because at that point, like you really couldn't marry higher than the king. Like the king was as high. And I think in Anne's head, it was like, okay, well, if we can get the Pope to sign off, if we can get, and then when that didn't happen, they were like, okay, well, if we can get, this new idea moving and this new, because really the new religious changes dovetailed really well with making Anne queen. Like the two, you can see them as two separate issues, right? Because reform was already starting to happen in the church. Are you there? And so, I mean, the divorce, the great matter itself, and the Reformation itself are actually two separate issues because the Reformation had already begun. And it just so happened that this new marriage with Anne kind of fit into that, just the pieces fit together so well and dovetailed together that then they kind of get conflated because really, you had to have the Reformation in order to have the marriage. You almost couldn't have one without the other. And so then they end up kind of going together. But I think that, Anne came in and she was really well educated. She was very smart. She was very opinionated. She, had learned how to behave at court. And I think that that's what made her really attractive.
Mm-hmm. And so you talked a little bit about like the idea that she had agency. There's the myth that like her father was almost like pimping her and her sister out and stuff. Like tell me what you think about that.
I mean, I don't believe that at all. And in fact, actually, I believe there's commentary. I don't know if is actually words from Thomas Boleyn himself, but there is commentary that Thomas doesn't actually want this match between, Anne and the king because he just, he thinks that she's going to be a mistress and then she's going to be discarded like Mary was, and so it really kind of isn't until it becomes like a sure thing that Anne is going to become queen that they really like put their efforts behind it. And I don't know. I mean, I feel like the jury is kind of out as far as how Mary became a mistress to the king. And of course, like we can't even date it for sure. We don't even know how long, literally all we have to go on. And it's not even actually a confirmation. It's just kind of like he says, never with the mother,
Right.
Yeah. And then we have the dispensation. The dispensation says perhaps if he had perhaps had, this the relationship of more than however many degrees. Like there's any actual confirmation. No, I think that there's enough circumstantial evidence that we could say, yes, it did happen. Um, but I tend to think that I mean, Mary she was clearly very different than Anne. And I think that maybe it was something she kind of got swept up in, or, because at that time, Henry was young and he was attractive and he was having relations with I mean, there are all sorts of stories about him with different young ladies of the court. And so I think that was probably what happened, and then she got married to William Carey because it was like, "Okay, well, we're done with that. We're gonna set you on your path."
Yeah.
And yeah.
So talk to me about the response to Anne becoming queen and to their marriage. And maybe talk to me a little bit about, let's back up, their timeline and how they eventually got married. So we're looking at like 1532 is the trip to Calais, where
Mhm.
they start having relations, right? And there was
Right.
apparently a secret. Talk to me about like the timeline then for that next year leading up to the birth of Elizabeth, let's just say from September to September.
Yeah. Yeah. So they were over in Calais, and that was kind of like their great triumph, right? Because Francois really sort of greeted Anne as the queen. And there was a whole lot of pomp and circumstance, and it was just seen as very blessed. And then these storms came and they weren't able to leave. So, of course, everybody is kind of hunkered down. And, Anne and Henry are really excited. They have just, they have managed to like accomplish what they did not think was going to happen. They managed to do it. They get, Francis's buy-in. And so I'm sure if they already having some level of intimacy, like, they just kinda got to the point where they're like, "It's happening, right? We
Right.
don't have to wait." And
Right.
they were really excited, and you know, I think January is just too I mean, I think that put, um Elizabeth too premature for me. I mean, obviously, there's only a difference of a couple of months between so when they come back, they're back in England in January, and they, get married in secret. So there are only a few witnesses, and we know George is one of them. And then we also know that there was a woman, there was another woman, one of Anne's women who was part of it as well. Um, but yeah, it was very, very secret. And so, I think, well, to as an example, I was pregnant. My son was born literally just a couple of days before Elizabeth's birthday,
Oh,
and I fell pregnant with him in early December.
right. Yeah.
So for me, I feel like, to me, it almost I mean, January, like, maybe, but
And
Logan was not he was right on time, like, he was right at his and
yeah.
so that sticks in my mind a lot. Like, I think about that, and so that's what makes me think that January was just too late.
Hannah's
January
Hannah was originally she was early, but her original due date was the 21st of August. So like 2, 3 weeks, two
Yeah,
and a half. And that was Thanksgiving weekend. Funny how we know this stuff. So that was the end
yeah,
of November. Yeah. Yeah.
right, right, right. Well, we were tracking, and
Right.
so
Exactly.
that's how I know, right? And so,
Me
like,
too.
I know, and so I think about that, and then I think about how it just very much fits. It does fit a narrative that they were there, she got pregnant, and by January, she would have known, or
Right.
she would have been pretty, clear. She had at least was very late.
Mhm.
And then they needed to get married,
Right.
right? Because if you think about it, like, it was still kind of a rush. Like, yes, they had accomplished a lot, and it was pretty sure that they were gonna be able to get married and everything. But you would think that after as hard as they fought and as much time, that they would have waited, and they didn't do that. So, that's just I mean, we don't have anything, the smoking gun, but
Right.
in my opinion, and so I think that there's a little jubilation when she, finds out that she's pregnant, and all of the astrologers are saying, "Oh, it's gonna be a boy."
Yeah. Yeah. And how
Yeah.
like, how did the crowds react? Because there's those stories of, like, when she was being crowned, her processions of people with the HA, like, laughing and saying, "Ha ha." What
Right.
and even, like, so I think it's in the Tudors, one of the shows, they showed, like, this kind of mob attacking her before she was queen because they were so supportive of
Yeah.
Catherine. Like, talk to me about how people viewed her.
And that did happen. There was a mob. They had
Mhm.
actually gone, and I know this specifically because I wrote this scene in The Raven's Widow, and I remember just being like gobsmacked when I read actual account of this. That the and one thing that's really interesting is that Anne, it's really clear that Anne had the full support of the Boleyns. This kind of ties back into that question that you asked. And one of the things that really stands out to me is that they had homes that were very near to London so that Anne could be at London. They could attend the trial of Catherine. They could attend Parliament. They could attend all of these things because so when this mob happened, Anne was staying at her father's house on the Strand. So he had a house on the Strand, and then the Crown was actually paying for an apartment for Jane and George
Okay.
so that they could live there and be near the court while Anne was at court.
Gotcha.
So Jane and George were a huge presence, in that early part, and were really supportive of her, which, it's often said that Jane is not, but I mean, there's just so many of these little details that I don't know if people have missed, or if maybe they're not really realizing that Jane is also part of that. So I found a lot of things that way that were attached to George, but Jane was also listed in there in some way. And that was one of them, is that, Henry paid for an apartment for them to live in, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So there was kind of mixed feelings about uh, within the populace at large about
Yeah.
her. I'm just
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so she was at this house in the Strand, and these women just showed up because they were all there and they were kind of planning out her household. And a bunch of just regular civilians like showed up, and they were yelling at her, calling her a whore, calling her names, throwing stuff at her, and they just like ran down to the river, got on the riverboat, and like got away just in time. But these things were happening quite often because, they were in support of Catherine, and they
yeah.
were seeing how she was being treated in court, and by Henry and his advisors. And they they couldn't act out against Henry, but they
Right.
could act out against Anne.
Yeah, for sure. And it makes
Yeah.
sense why they would be upset. Catherine was treated terribly, and you don't have so often history, people want to pit these women against each other. And I mean, in the end, they were kind of against each other, but it's really Henry who's the monster here. Like, let's not
Right.
forget. Like,
Yeah. And I mean, as as much influence as Anne did, ultimately there wasn't a thing that she could do. Even if she were to say, you know what, no, 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 like never mind. This is too much. I don't, we've gone too far. I don't want to there there's no way that Anne could have said that to the king at any time.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Yeah. It's really sad. It's really
Yes, it
sad.
is.
For both all these women, like getting mixed up with him, bad move. I mean, not like
Right?
they could have, but not like they could have made a choice. Um, so tell me about then how, like, so that was regular women who and regular people who there was this kind of divide and people still supported Catherine. What about like the nobility? Were the nobility quick to jump on supporting Anne and supporting the Boleyns? Or I mean, I'm thinking like no, because there was still this conservative faction. Talk to me about that.
Yeah. Well, it was really kind of divided. Both Catherine and Anne had their supporters. And, I think that they were probably pretty equally split down the middle. You tended to see most of the newer nobles were for the more of the Boleyn faction. And then you had kind of the more older traditional conservative nobles were for Catherine. But at the same time, you had Norfolk, who was like one of the oldest noble in court, and he was related to Anne, and he
Yes.
did support Anne for a time. But then when she, you know, drew some boundaries with him, he did not like that. And,
Right.
thought, who are you to tell
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
And so he defected to the other side. And so you almost could not assume you couldn't assume who supported which side because I mean it just depended sometimes on which way the wind was blowing and who had the king's ear at that time. And even we're discovering some stories that, you have John Gage, who was the constable of the Tower. He was actually the constable of the Tower after Anne's death because Master Kingston was. But John Gage, he was actually, he was trying to resign in protest of Anne. And, you know, complained about her because he was conservative and he didn't like the new Reformation changes. But then, as we found out, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, uh, Dr. Kate McCaffrey from Heber discovered that, John Gage had been him and his wife had kept Anne Boleyn's Book of Hours. That was the last place you would think it would be, but it was there. And so I think that, like, we have to remember that we're looking at official paperwork, right? And even today, sometimes the things that we put in official paperwork is not necessarily the way that we really feel. And so I think that we can make our best guesses as to who was on whose side and why. But I think the reality is that we're never going to actually know, you
Yeah.
know, who who were the movers behind Anne's downfall.
Right.
We all think that it was Cromwell, and certainly he had a big hand in it. but how much more of a hand did Henry have in it? Or did these other people who worked for Cromwell? I mean, it's all very shadowy.
Truly, and it's hard to know with the 500 years away and looking at incomplete records and all of that. So, and nobody knows, and everybody's guessing, and you can put together some good guesses, some educated guesses, but
Yeah.
it's to guess. So you had said like I want to go back to this point you asked about, or you mentioned about like the Reformation was already happening before Anne. And so I'm wondering how, like, just playing some alternative history, if, let's say, Catherine had had a son and there was no need to go outside, how do you think history might have gone without Anne? Would England have hosted the Spanish Inquisition, the northern part? Or like, do you, because Henry was the defender of the faith, all that, or do you
Yeah.
that these that the power of the Reformation would have taken over eventually anyway? What are your thoughts on that?
That is such a good question. And as a baptized and confirmed Lutheran, I
Uh-huh.
want to say that the Reformation would have happened anyways.
Okay.
I
Jonathan's
mean,
also a baptized and confirmed Lutheran, so that's fun. You think like the power of the Bible in the vernacular and the getting rid of the popish stuff and having a direct relationship with God and all of that was going to overpower it.
yes, yeah. I think ultimately that would have won out. I think that really we give this, Anne and Henry so much credit for the Reformation, but really they never changed. They practicing Catholics, right? They only did away with the things that did not benefit them. But I mean, Henry was crawling to the cross like 2 years before he died, well after Anne had died. And so, you know, I really the people surrounding Henry, I would say actually Thomas Cromwell did more for the Reformation than Henry they did. Yeah. I think what it was is Henry had a problem. And there were people around him that said, look what can solve the problem.
Right. Well, so
But
that's
they were already deeply embedded. I mean, as we know, like Thomas Cranmer, he was deeply embedded in that already, and it was the Boleyns who said, well, actually,
yeah.
you're our friend.
So that makes me wonder, like, if Henry hadn't had that problem, would there have been a use for Thomas Cromwell? Would there, I mean, Wolsey wouldn't have fallen, right? Because he wouldn't have had to, like, so all of that, would there have been a use for Cranmer? Would there be, who knows? It's interesting to think about. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
I think it ultimately would have happened, but I think that the players might have been a little bit different.
gotcha. I like to think of that too, because I am an Episcopalian. So, it's a little bit the same, go Protestants.
Yes.
Team Bible and English. Uh, so what? All right. So we've got, I guess just I want to ask you about what she accomplished as queen and then kind of I guess just her downfall we can talk a little bit about and just how that changed England and the idea that a queen could be killed and just what that did to England, if anything. And then we can wrap up with that. So tell me a little bit about her reign as queen.
Yeah. I mean, for being a queen regent, she actually had quite a lot of influence on Henry, particularly in the early days before she was actually queen. Because really she was not a queen, but in that role for longer than she actually was a queen and in the role.
Okay.
So for me, I I have a hard time separating the two. because in many ways she was already, wielding that power. And, I think that she brought in a lot, like you said, with the Reformation and stuff like that, she brought in a lot of the literature and the players. I mean, her and George were bringing in literature from Protestants on the continent. And we know this because some of it still exists and is in the British Library because it was confiscated from them. And they kind of had a tendency to know the right people. They knew the right people, and I want to say that they were very good at sizing up how people, like, how a person could help them best. Not, and I don't say that in a selfish way, not like help them, but like what they could get the best from a person, right? I think, and like putting them, kind of influencing them into these roles of where they should be in the court. I think that her and her dad, and her brother had a huge hand in it. And she also, I think, she sort of could, I'm trying to figure out how to like phrase it, because Anne wasn't a feminist. And I think that there's really a draw to want to call her that, but she wasn't. But she did elevate women in many ways that she could. She really was known for taking care of her women. You know, and I'm not talking about the nobles who attended on her. I'm talking about like her gentlewomen, her maids that worked with her on a daily basis. She could be very, very generous to them. Um, she would, she helped with education, helped funding education, and she, so she did do a lot of things that were in the realm of what we would consider feminism today, but she was also a huge part of the patriarchy.
Yeah,
And maintained that role too.
I have such an issue when people put those modern, we've talked about this before, haven't we?
Yeah.
Talked about this,
Yeah.
these modern terminologies on people who wouldn't have understood it. It's not, I don't know, it's kind of like if in 500 years there's
Mhm.
some movement of some type of something, we wouldn't, like, we can't even think about it right now because we don't know
Yeah.
the thought about it, right? And so if
Yeah.
500 years there's some movement for something, and they go back and say, oh well, Adrienne,
Right.
she was clear, like, read Adrienne's book, she was clearly a wussa bussa fussa, huh? Like, I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like, it bugs me to put that on people because I don't think it's fair
Right.
to give them.
Right. Right. And it's a completely different, um, a feminist today is not the same as what a feminist back then would have been. And in fact, there was not really any possible way for you to be a feminist.
Yeah. And it changes.
You
Uh,
right,
Feminism today is different than feminism was in the 30s, is different than feminism
right,
was the early suffragettes. It's like all like,
right,
I don't know. So
right.
stuff like that. So just to go back
And
and be like,
that
oh, Anne was a feminist. Yeah, I don't like
we
that.
also have to like consider the fact that these labels like do not, even if she was a feminist, that does not make her perfect. It does not mean that she maintained this like perfect ideal. It's one of the things about Anne is that she truly is a gray character because she did some really dumb things. When she wasn't dumb, she was incredibly intelligent and clever, but she was a human, right? And sometimes we do things that are illogical or rash or impulsive or
Just dumb.
whatever. Yeah. just dumb. And when we always want him to make her the saint or the sinner, but really it's kind of somewhere in the middle. Because yes, she did, she did do a lot for women, but at the same time, she wasn't doing anything that was outside the realm of what she should have been doing as queen.
And like
You
Catherine of
know?
Aragon did a lot for women being like a warrior queen who, wanted to go
Right.
lead a battle and the Battle of Flodden and all of that. Like that's a
Yeah.
really big step for women too. So
Yeah.
just like again, pitting
Right.
people against each other. Anyway,
Right.
my
Right.
soapbox. I will now
I
skip my soapbox.
well, and and I'm almost like so hesitant to say it because I'm so nervous about
Oh,
the Anne
just
Boleyn warriors coming for me. And this is going to be a controversial take. And I think the reality is that Catherine had more accomplishments that she of things she did on her own, right? But
yeah,
the accomplishments that we attribute to Anne, a lot of them are colored by one, our more modern thinking, then also two, the fact that we give her credit for a significant part of the Reformation that was actually being done by other people. And that's not to say that I don't think Anne accomplished things, because I do think that she did accomplish a lot of things.
oh yeah,
But they weren't outside really the prescribed notions of what a queen should be doing. So
Mhm.
I think if we were to just look at it and say who was more accomplished, Catherine or Anne, well, it's really easy to say Catherine, right? Because, Flodden, yes, she was critically pregnant. Yes, she this and all of those things. Anne doesn't really have that.
Right.
But that does not mean that, she didn't accomplish things, because she did. And she elevated voices. She brought in more knowledge. Like she kind of had invisible hands in things, right? But she wasn't doing them alone.
Yes.
She was, it was a groundswell that she was a
I
big part of.
I'm excited to see if there's any Anne Boleyn warriors who get mad at this. I'm here for it. We need to- No, I won't. I don't read comments.
Me. I love Anne, but it's so, because I came into this starting out with Anne, right? Like she was my entree into the world of the Tudors, and my perception of her has changed a lot, as my research horizons have expanded
Yeah.
and looked outside of the Anne sphere,
Right.
because there's a lot more to Tudor history than just Anne.
Is. There is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've just spent a lot of time talking about her, but because she is still important, but obviously,
Yes.
but there's lots more than just Anne. There was other people then doing other things.
Yeah.
Mind blown. Anyway, you've been so generous. I want you to tell people where they can find you, all of the cool things that you're up to, all of the amazing stuff, how they can buy your books, all of that kind of stuff. So
Well,
go.
not recently, a couple of months ago, I deactivated Facebook because I just needed to be done. So I'm not really on Facebook anymore, but I am on Instagram and I have a TikTok, and mostly they're just funny videos of my cat.
Nice. That's
But I
awesome.
started trying to branch out, and I'm learning that medium a lot more.
Mhm.
Let's see. So, and I also have a website. You can find me at Adrienne-Dillard.com, because Adrienne Dillard was already taken. Um, I know. Let's see. So you can find my books on Amazon. You can find them on barnesandnoble.com. You can buy them, the Apple Store, wherever
All the
you get
places.
wherever you get your books from. And I'm kind of working on a couple of different things right now. So I'm continuing to research into George Boleyn and his book. So I will be going back to the British Library next year to do some more research on his book, The Torments of Marriage.
Okay. That
But yeah, I'm working on that. I'm also working on a contemporary novel, and it's called Project Archer. And so it's sort of an autobiography, but it's like part true and part false.
oh,
So there's going to be a lot of my experiences in there, but it's going to be a fictional story. But yeah. So it's kind of interesting and new, and I've almost got 2 chapters written. So I'm working
nice.
on that. And then, of course, I'm still researching my book on the Knoll sisters. So I'm writing about Elizabeth and Lettice Knowles. And it'll be called The Sisters Knoll. And it'll kind of center on Lettice and her relationship with Elizabeth, the queen.
Right.
And then also Elizabeth Noel's relationship with the queen, because they had very different relationships with her. And so it'll be kind of fun because you'll get to see a young Queen Elizabeth through the eyes of 2 of her closest relatives who have 2 very different perspectives of her. And then there's that kind of classic sister tussle.
Nice. I just love you so much. I need more Adrienne Dillard in my life. That's just like all I can say. You're just such a joy. You're just such a bright light of like, I don't know, you just are this light of joy. And I just love it. Thank you.